When I was cycling around the Scottish Islands and Highlands, I started my journey going across on the ferry to Arran, and a group of four cyclists who, on hearing I intended to cycle the North Coast 500 as part of that, were horrified and were quite convinced I would die. Well, it's this 500 mile long driving route that runs along the north coast of Scotland. It's actually a big loop that basically goes down and across the kind of Northern Highlands. And it brings you through some of the most spectacular scenery in Scotland and some of the most isolated areas.
So I'm on the NC500 coming out of Ullapool. It's about 7:30 in the evening. There's very little traffic. I just passed out the first about 5 minutes. It's warm, it is windy, but it's absolutely stunning.
Keeping the batteries charged on the route wasn't that difficult. I was able to do a mixture of spontaneous charging when I was having a meal and also campsite charging, and I did one night in a hotel. I would say though I carry two 500 watt batteries, so that gives me quite a considerable range between charges, probably in this context about 220-240 kilometers. Now, in terms of food and drink, the North Coast 500 is a bit of a challenge in that the settlements are quite long distances apart, and some of them don't have much in them actually. Like there's a couple I went through, it's just a few houses, there's no shops, maybe there's a public toilet or something, but that's about it. So you basically do want to have checked out in advance where you think you can stop to buy groceries, buy water perhaps, and also what pubs and restaurants exist. Really not very many, outside the towns on the route there's almost nothing, and also of course what their actual opening hours are going to be, particularly if you're travelling a bit outside season. How hard is the North Coast 500 as a cycle? I would actually say it's very tough. There are a lot of pretty extreme hills, and it's not a case that there's a hill you go up and then you come down again and that's it. There's an awful lot of places where you go up a very steep hill, you come down really quickly, you go up another very steep hill, you come down really quickly again, and that in the course of the sort of days I was doing that could be happening 5 to 8 times. And gradients, I mean there's definitely some gradients pushing up towards 15-20% on some of those, so yeah, tough from that point of view. Also very tough in terms of potential weather conditions. Now, the first day I had the first evening cycle I had was beautiful. It was a still evening. It was sunny. It was absolutely perfect conditions. But then when I did hit really vicious weather on the third day in particular, so that's kind of Dunnes to Betty Hill and then Betty Hill to Castletown, those 2 days, that was pretty tough going. You're talking about really, really driving wind, driving rain coming, at you almost horizontally, being battered around the place. In fact, the morning of the second day, coming down and across Kylesku Bridge, although there wasn't much rain at that point, the wind was so intense that the bridge itself was quite frightening when you were cycling on it, because it was a crosswind, and it was, you could feel it pushing you out across the road, and it wasn't a constant wind, it was gusts, so sometimes it would be there and sometimes it wouldn't. You'll get an impression of the wind just from the selfie videos I recorded with my phone. An awful lot of them, it's quite hard to make out what I'm saying because of the wind. If you're used to strong wind conditions, it's fine. If you've cycled the Atlantic coast in Ireland, for instance, well, yeah, it's that sort of experience. I think probably if you're coming from the Outer Hebrides and you've been cycling on either Uster or Lewis and Harris, then yes, you'll already know about wind. So, but it is something to be aware of. The odds of you encountering strong wind are very, very high. The odds of you encountering strong wind combined with heavy rain are also quite high. You could be lucky, but you definitely want to be prepared for that. Accommodation wise, I hadn't booked anything in advance, and for most of the trip to that point, I'd actually been doing a lot of wild camping. However, the weather was really turning at this point, so it was getting quite wet and windy. And so I was pretty open, in other words, to booking into a campsite so I could have a shower, basically, or be somewhere dry. Now, in practice, because at the initial stage I wanted to make as much progress as possible to beat an incoming storm, or at least to get as far ahead of it as possible. So the first night I wild camped at Inch de Donf. There's a car park there that is used for people doing mountain walking. It's just beside the hotel. So I tucked myself into one corner of that. So a general commentary on wild camping, there is a problem with the Highlands and Islands in general, and the North Coast 500 in particular, that the local all year round population is quite small, the infrastructure is quite basic, but you've a huge amount of people arriving as tourists in the summer, and because there's not that many hotels, a lot of those people are in camper vans, or they're doing car camping, or they're camping beside the car or whatever. There's quite a lot of people, camping in parking places and that sort of stuff, and a certain amount of resentment about that. Now, I didn't experience any of that as a cyclist. I suspect that, when people look at you on your bike and realise you've cycled hundreds of kilometres to get there, they'll probably go, yeah, far enough.
So that's more or less the reason why I cycled. I think I probably came through that pass. I'm not sure about that.
In terms of the formal campsites, they're pretty frequent along the route. There's probably one every 40 kilometres, maybe 50 kilometres might be the greatest distance between them. There is the challenge if you're cycling, you don't really know what distance you're going to make in a day. You can't really book ahead realistically necessarily. I had the impression that the places I stayed in were used to cyclists and were fairly flexible about that. I think in one of them I just turned up, in another one I had booked I think that morning. And the other issue is a lot of them have curfew hours of say 7 o'clock. You need to be, you have to book in by 7. But in the cases where I knew I would get there much later, and if you're cycling, you kind of want to cycle in the evening, it's nicer, there's less traffic. I just contacted them and said, hey, is that okay? And they were grand with it. So, it should be possible. There's a lot of places you can wild camp close enough to a road that you can get your bike there. Be aware that some of the more obvious pretty places you can see on the maps may have no camping signs placed there by the Highland Council, just because too many people are camping there at the moment. So you might get somewhere and find that's there. How you deal with that, up to you. I mean, if it was late in the evening and you're not going to be able to do another 10 or 20 kilometres, I would do a polite dusk to dawn camp and be gone very early. Just something to be aware of. Will there be midges? Yes. There almost certainly will be midges if the wind dies down at all. I would definitely recommend in getting a good head net, particularly if you intend to camp, so that you can get some rest when you've stopped. I had a particularly horrific experience one day where every time I stopped for a break, I just got swarmed by midges within about 30 seconds.
The North Coast, I think another 3 or 4 kilometres, there's an extraordinary downhill. I don't know, it must be 10 or 15 kilometres or something. It felt very, very long, very impressive. The uphill bit was hard, but really feels like quite something. I would do the whole thing just for that load. Only a few kilometres to Dunnes. I've made incredible progress, shot up the North Coast in a day and a half basically, and so dodged the wind change.
Regrets? Yes. My biggest regret, in fact, is I did the thing a bit too fast. Now, that was partially me running away from the storm that was coming in, but I would definitely recommend building in times for breaks so you can stop and look at things as you go past them. There's a lot of really worthwhile stuff. For instance, this is Smoo Caves, just outside Dunnes, which I stopped for about half an hour at. I definitely make more time. I should have made more.
The forecast was promising light rain, but it got a bit heavier, and of course just at the top of the bloody mountains as well. But the view is pretty beautiful.
The thing it's kind of infamous for is a lot of it is on what's called single track road. So that's road where there's only room for one car. However, there's traffic is moving in two directions, and the way that's handled is they have passing places. So the idea is when a car is coming towards you, one of you pulls into a passing place to allow the other one to pass. With cycling, that initially sounds like it's going to be very difficult. In practice, it was fine. What gear to bring? Well, you need to be realistic. This is not going to be shorts, t-shirt and a hammock to sleep in. Unless you're incredibly lucky. And if you're that lucky, you're probably going to be eaten alive by midges, so probably not lucky at all. So really, you want to be planning for weather that's going to be quite cold, particularly at night, and quite heavy rain. And what you particularly don't want, the combination, is it getting soaked and then it being cold. So the way I travel, I carry two fleece tops, so I can wear both of them at once. I carry a very light, pack-light, waterproof rain jacket that will keep rain out for about 2 hours, and then, although it leaks a little with the two fleeces on, they're not going to get absolutely soaked. I do bring waterproof trousers, and a pair of my cycling trousers are ones that dry out very fast, and then for sleeping I use thermal merino wool underwear, so long johns. I have a lightweight sleeping bag, but I have a sheet bag that goes inside of that, and a mat, obviously, and all that's inside a tent that keeps out rain. It's an MSO hubber, so it keeps out pretty heavy rain, and also keeps out midges, which is pretty important. So with all of that, you're talking about at least a pannier full of sleeping equipment and camping equipment, more realistically about a pannier and a half. It's not a light packing trip.
Yes, I'm having yet another day of torrential rain, and once again have dived into a bush shelter because they're almost completely enclosed because it's lashing out there. Man, even the sheep across the road are hiding from it. They're all gone under the tree.
If you wanted to just restrict things to tiny bike pack style bags, I think you'd be pretty much stuck with having to B&B and hotel it. And the one thing I would say, if you're doing that, is there are not very many of either. You would need to book that well in advance, so you'd have an entirely different experience of doing it. The benefit would be you'd be much lighter as well, so you'd go up those hills a lot easier, but you would need to be much more pre-planned and sticking to schedule. And the difficulty with sticking to schedule is that if you get a disastrous spell of really bad weather, really high winds for instance, combined with high rain, it might be quite tricky to actually complete a section on the time you need to. There's certainly points like Kolesky Bridge where you're going down over very exposed sections and there's strong crosswinds. I'd be quite nervous about cycling that in gale force winds, but up to you. There isn't a right answer to this. There's a number of things you could try.
In what's fast becoming a habit, greetings from yet another bush shelter in the rain. This time I'm just up the road from John O'Groats. It's not lashing down, it's unpleasantly wet, but there's a big heavy wind, and I've just cycled 20 kilometres and I need a break, so I thought, there's a bush shelter, I'll dive into it.
Once you've got to Ray and New Ray, basically shortly afterwards, the roads are starting to get much busier, much higher concentrations of population basically along here, bigger cities and stuff. So I'd recommend looking for ways to get off the NC500 car route and use the parallel roads, which are much quieter and rural and are actually great for cyclists. You don't basically all the way from Melvick around to John of Groat's. There's only a couple of places where you have to come back onto what are the busy main roads. Otherwise, there's back roads that are not even all that longer in terms of distance, possibly a little hillier, but actually are really quite pleasant cycles. I did do a stretch of the main road coming back out of Thurso, and it was quite unpleasant, even quite late in the evening, so I would definitely avoid that. Basically what I'm saying here is don't feel confined to the North Coast 500 route when it all gets a little bit too dodgy and dangerous. On the ferry here, I'm on my way to Orkney. I'm going to be spending 3 days in Orkney. We're going to skip that bit. I'm going to come back, and then I'm going to go back up towards Melvick. And then from Melvick, I'm going to go down the Lumber Road that runs down to just Hemsdale. Now, that's a great way of skipping the really dodgy part of the entire route and at the same time experiencing yet another beautiful aspect of the Highlands. That road, there's almost no traffic on it. There are lumber lorries, but actually if you're a cyclist, you hear a lumber lorry coming from a kilometre away, and I only ran into 3 or 4 of them on the whole 60 kilometres. There's very little on the road otherwise. There's no shops. There is possibly one cafe, I think, but I wasn't sure if it was open when I went past it. So that's what it's like, but it's amazing. And then as you come down, right at the end of it, about 5 kilometres before the end, there's a side road, and that side road leads you up over this amazing mountain pass. Accidentally turned out to be the second highest point of my entire month-long journey. But take that. It'll be a struggle going up. It'll be wonderful coming down. It will take another 5 or 6 kilometres off the A9. Then you're kind of stuck on the A9 for a bit. There's bits you can take off. There's bits you can't. But you're basically heading down towards Fronach and Tain and the bridges. You have a whole sequence of big bridges on the A9 that are the only way to get across without huge detours for quite a long time. But you take all those, you'll eventually get to Dingwall, and that's where we separate, because at Dingwall I was off the NC500. Instead I went to Inverness, and then I followed the Great Glen all the way over to Oban. That's another story. You can catch up on that on my day-by-day diaries of my entire Highlands trip. So this is the A9 here. It gives you an idea of how busy it is. Remember, this is actually in the late afternoon, so it got much busier. It went into the evening. Here is a little section going around Black Isle. So this is where you can get off the A9 for a bit, although you're still going to be stuck having to cross over on the Firth of Fronach Bridge. And here we are crossing the bridge. We're just about to get onto the bridge proper. There's a little parking space this side of it. But I think it's 2 kilometres long, so it's quite good. So basically my suggestion for the bridge is hit it in the evening when the traffic's lighter, and then just pedal hell for leather to cross it as fast as possible. The next day coming out of Tain, the roads were a lot better, so don't worry too much about the detail, because I'm going to pull up a map and bring you through the stages step by step and show you specifically where I stopped each night. But let's first of all consider one last question. Would I cycle the North Coast 500 again? Absolutely. It was tough going. I got some really atrocious weather, but it's absolutely an incredible cycle. The beauty of it is famous already, but it's an entirely different experience cycling through that than driving through it in a car. When you're cycling, you're very much in the landscape. You're part of it. You can hear everything that's happening around you. You obviously you feel the wind. If the wind's blowing, you feel the rain. You also have the advantage that if you're a car, there's not that many places you can actually pull in, and you're not meant to pull into passing places to actually stop, all that sort of stuff. If you're on a bicycle, you can pull in anyway. You can get the bike off the road. It's no actual problem. So your whole experience of that is going to be really, really fantastic. So yeah, if you're thinking of doing it and you're not sure and you're nervous about the weather and stuff, yes, those are all problems, but it is definitely worthwhile. I did it because I wanted to do it once, and now that I've done it, I want to do it again. Okay, so let's look at a map of the route I took in more detail. This is using the Cycle Travel website, and I'm using the OpenStreetMap player. So I started here in Ullapool. I'd come over from the Outer Hebrides on the ferry. Setting off that first evening, we're coming up. And then this is the car park at Inchydonf. Well, I stopped in at the public car park, around the back. The hotel is here. I'd actually tried to book into the hotel, but they'd no availability. And then a big long day with lots of hills, up, 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 and then that big descent down, and then stopped at Sango Sands camping site here in Durness. And then another big day, and this is the day that there's a lot of rain. And the big loop around the sea lock and across the bog. And then this is Kyle of Tongue here. So up out of Kyle of Tongue again and up, and then up here to Betty Hill. And then, so this is the very basic campsite in Betty Hill I stayed in. It doesn't even have a reception. The owner just turns up in a car. There's also quite a good cafe restaurant up here behind it if you're up there. And then from Betty Hill, another very wet day, coming down and down and down and down some more until we reach Thurso. Now you can see I'm off the A99 here, coming around the back and into Thurso, and then again coming off that main route to Castletown. And I stayed in the Castletown Hotel, which is right in the centre. It's actually quite affordable. It's a very big place, so it was one of the more affordable hotel type accommodation I stayed. So that evening I cycled to Dunnet Head, just here, and then on to John O'Groats. Now in reality at this point I crossed over to Orkney and did this loop here, and then came back on the other side of Thurso, here, and then I went back up to Melvick campsite, which is just here. That one actually is really well facilitated. It's got a restaurant. I knew I was going to arrive a couple of hours after curfew, so I rang them, and not only did they not rang them, I emailed them. Not only did they say that was okay, they also made a reservation for me in the restaurant because I had worked out I'd be arriving just about 10 minutes before they closed. So I really appreciated that. And then down this road, which is that lumber road I was talking about, very little on it indeed. Right down. So the main part of that lumber road continues here to Hemsdale, but there's this offshoot that goes up over the mountain pass. That actually was one of the most spectacular parts of my entire month in the Highlands, so that's well worth doing. And then there's this section here where you're just stuck on the A9 for bits of this. It's really unpleasant. You're not going to enjoy it. I would recommend doing what I did, which is try and do it in the evening as far as possible, so at least a lot of the work transport has died down. There were still a few big lorries on it. Now you can come off it for sections. There's detours, so you can miss quite parts of it, but you're coming back on it as you approach each of the bridges. You miss a section here at Black Isle, but then you're back on it for the bridge over the Forth of Fannock, I think is the right pronunciation. And then I came into Tain that evening. It's about 8 o'clock in the evening. I camped at the car park, which there's some sport fields and stuff there. And then next day, up bright and early and on to Dingwall. Again, I'm off the main road for this entire section. It's a parallel road. And then came into Dingwall. And that's the kind of NC500 part of my month. I spent, about 5 days that is. So I actually spent 30 days cycling around the Highlands. So as you can imagine, I did a much bigger loop. In fact, what I had done is I had come over from Arran, worked my way up through the Western Islands, through Skye, through the Outer Hebrides, across to Ullapool, around Orkney, and then here at Inverness. I'd gone to Inverness and I'd come down the Great Glen to Oban and then caught a train home from there. So check out the rest of my playlists for the other days in the Islands and Highlands. I hope you enjoyed my video about cycling the North Coast 500 and it's inspired you to do it. If you did, please do give the channel a follow. You'll also find lots of videos here on doing similar trips around Ireland, and I'll be adding other countries as I go there. The other thing I'm doing is adding reviews of the gear I use, my tent, my bike, all that sort of stuff, but only after I've done a lot of usage, you know. So I put 6,000 kilometers of touring on the bike before I did a review, and 150 nights sleeping in the tent. So if you're thinking about bikepacking or cycle touring, it's hopefully quite useful hints or discussions about how things actually work in practice. And finally, if you did find this video good, then please do give me a thumbs up on it so more people get to see it. Thank you.